David and Abraham. Leaving off where I was last week, we discussed some of the names in this genealogy, and so many of these names, they were involved in all kinds of sin. They were involved in all kinds of things, and we're going to focus on these two because we know these two. Number one is David, who sinned terribly multiple times. Most of us pay attention to the sin with Bathsheba and Uriah when he had this, but David did a lot of bad things. One instance, he disobeyed God. He took a census when God said not to do it, and several 100,000 people died as a result of that decision. So there's a lot of stuff that David did wrong, but yet God calls him a man after his own heart. Why? Because he was always in a state of repentance. So you have David. He sins with Bathsheba, has her husband murdered. David, what we would consider a polygamist, he would, if you put him in today's framework, he would not have a very good terminology to explain David. Okay, if we put him in the case of some of the preachers nowadays, they get caught in certain things, and that's how we would label it. And so David had a moniker attached to him. He was an adulterer. Abraham lied about Sarah, gave her to the king as if she was his sister. So we have two evident sinners that Jesus comes from that line. And we see the seed was the Son of God. That is evidence of God's grace. So God used these two, one to father the nation of Messiah, the other to father the royal line. Now Jesus is the son of David and also the son of Abraham. So his connection with the Hebrew people is both racial and royal, as we discussed a little bit last week. And that's why David comes first. That's the point. Matthew is trying to make this point. He doesn't say Abraham then David. He says David then Abraham, because he's pointing us to the fact that Jesus is king. And by the way, grace was extended to every name listed here in this passage, which is remarkable. So we see that David, he obviously shaped up, so did Abraham. We see it in Solomon. We see it with Isaac, even though they made multiple mistakes. For example, the son of David, to whom David looked to for the next step in this in his line, he was terrible. Solomon was terrible. He made a lot of mistakes. His story is a disastrous failure in spite of his peaceful nature. We consider Solomon the wise man. But did you know there's a picture of him literally in the fields eating grass like a cow? Because he was banished to it. He was cursed. He had thousands of wives, concubines, you name it. So you see all this disappointment in these men, and yet we see the Messiah. So Jesus Christ, the son of David, son of Abraham, came to overcome the failures of those lines. Now watch this. The most fascinating thing here in verse 17. Look, all the generations from Abraham to David are 14, and from David until carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations, and from carrying away from Babylon unto Christ there are 14. So if you are taking notes, we're going to write this down. 3 eras. Now, the first period or the first era he mentions here are from Abraham to David. Now, that's the period which we call the patriarchs. That's the period of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Also, it includes judges. And it's in that period that you have other great patriarchs and great judges, and even females like Deborah, Barak, Samson. All of those different characters would fall in that era. I want to give you a little bit of a description of these eras. The patriarchal era, it was a period of heroism. And this was the period where Israel was made famous. It was in this time frame. So, for example, when the Israelites left Egypt, they went into the promised land. They became conquerors, basically. Following that, they went into the period of the judges, which again, you see these mighty heroes Samson, Gideon, even after following Joshua. You see these great, mighty men. So it was a period of heroism. You see people like Ruth, Jesse, the father of David. It was literally a period of greatness. And honestly, David would be considered as the pinnacle of Israel's existence. So it's like a large arc from Abraham all the way to Christ. And David's period would be like the high point as far as the way their nation. The second period is the period from David to the carrying away of Babylon. This is a period of decline. The first is a period of ascendancy. Again, it peaks at David. And as Israel goes from non-existence at Abraham's time to fame and glory in David's time. And now the second period is the period of the monarchy. So you have the patriarch or patriarchy, and now we have the monarchy. Up until King Saul, Israel had no human king. And the reason why Saul was even appointed is because the people wanted it so badly. And they wanted it so badly, they jumped the gun and hired the guy, or elected the guy, chose the guy that they thought would be best suited for the job, and we all know that was incorrect. God had other plans. But following David, we begin the period of the monarchy. And as soon as the monarchy came with Saul, and you remembered what happened from there, it started going downhill fairly quickly. You know why that is. It's simply when we try to insert our own will and our own agenda and our own methods aside from what God has already ordained, that's when things start to go south. And that's exactly what is happening to the nation of Israel. The reason why they wanted a monarch so bad is simply because all the other nations had one. That was it. It wasn't really for any other purpose. They just wanted to be like everyone else. But in fact, God did not ordain that. His path was what? It was a theocracy. He ruled. God ruled. It wasn't a democracy. It was a theocracy. God was in charge. God made the decisions, and he spoke through the prophets. So, and from David following, you have what we consider the glory days in Solomon. In Solomon's rule, there was a period of peace. There wasn't a lot of fighting. That's when you see them amass the most amount of wealth. It was basically, this was the glory days of the nation of Israel. But after Solomon, tragedy upon tragedy began to strike. And every once in a while, you would get a little glimpse of someone like Jehoshaphat in this genealogy. You would get some good ones. You would get a little glimpse of someone like Hezekiah. You would get a Josiah occasionally, and they were good and godly. But what seems to dominate this genealogy is a lot of Rehoboams, and I'm going to explain to you who these people are, or Manassehs, or Ahazes. These were very evil men. Again, all in the line of David, all in the line of Messiah. By the way, the line of Messiah, the term Messiah is a title. Okay, it's not necessarily a person. It is a title. So, these were evil men, and we see this as somewhat of a period of apostasy. And it's a period of degeneracy as well. And ultimately, they end up in captivity under Babylon. So you see a steady decline from Solomon all the way to their captivity. And so what's the third period? Number 3. The third period is from captivity unto Christ. Now, I'm going to show you something interesting about this period. We don't know hardly anything at all about this period. It's a period shrouded in darkness. It's about 600 years of datelessness. Okay? Names we don't even really know much about, like Abiud in this genealogy, or Zadok or Achim. I'm not going to read all these names again, but we don't really know all of these names. By the way, just a little bit of information here. There are approximately 400 years from the end of Malachi to the beginning of Matthew. So we have no actual word from God. There's no prophet of God until Matthew, when we see John the Baptist. Okay, so from Malachi to John the Baptist is roughly about 400 years. Now, a little bit of more information here. The modern Judaism that we see today, that we see evident during Jesus' time with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, and we're going to meet all those folks later, that period began during this time. All of the different rule systems, all of those different things, the rabbis, the different position came out of this period. Okay? And so what they did was they used some of the things from the Old Testament, from the Torah, and they applied it and basically made a man-domineering religion that still exists to this day. And this comes out of that period. So the story of Israel is the story of three eras. The national genealogy of Jesus is one of, we'll call it mingled pathos, we'll call it glory. It's one of both heroism and disgrace. It's both renown and obscure. So we see this period of heroism where everybody knows about it, then you see this other side where nobody knows anything. So we see the Christ coming from everything and nothing all at the same time, which is remarkable to me. I say all that to say this. He is the Messiah. We will see that he is the King, but he's also the King of grace. God's grace was given as evident in one woman, talking about Mary, two men, David and Abraham, and three eras that we've discussed. Finally, we're going to talk about four outcasts. We're going to get to what I preluded last week a little bit. We got four women in this genealogy, and all four of them would be considered outcasts. And there are only four women mentioned in this genealogy, just four. And so we're going to meet who they are. Woman number one, let's go to verse 3. It says, and Judah the father of Perez, and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram. Tamar, we're going to talk about Tamar. I don't think I want to name my daughter Tamar. It's just a little strange. But Tamar is the first lady in the genealogy. Her children, Pharez and Zerah. Now, what about Tamar? What kind of lady was Tamar? So I'm going to introduce you to her real quick. All right, you don't have to flip there. This is in Genesis chapter 38. You can just listen. It says, it was told Tamar, saying, Judah takes a wife for his firstborn. Judah wanted a wife for his firstborn, so he took this lady. It was told Tamar, saying, behold, your father-in-law goes up to Timnath to shear his sheep. Now this is Judah, her father-in-law. And she put her widow's garments off from her. Her husband had died. She covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself, got herself all dolled up, you see. And she sits in an open place by the way, on the way to Timnath, for she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given unto him as his wife. That's a whole other story. We won't go into that. But when Judah saw her, he saw that she was a harlot, because she had her face covered. And so he turned unto her, by the way, said, come, I pray thee, let me come in unto thee. In other words, come with me to the Casbah. And she said, what wilt thou give me, that thou mayest come unto me? In other words, I'm not doing this for nothing. I've got a price. Y'all get what's happening here? She's seducing her father-in-law. Okay, just so we're clear. Yeah. And he said, I will send you a kid from the flock. In other words, I'm going to give you a goat. And she said, will you give me a pledge? Can you give me a check? So I'll know till you send it. And he said, what pledge shall I give thee? And she said, your signet, your bracelets, your staff is in your hand. And he gave them to her and came in unto her, and she conceived by him. Nice lady, huh? Real nice lady, Tamar. harlotry, incest, you say, mercy, what is she doing in the Messianic line? Lord have mercy. By the way, when she wanted his signet, that means that was like a credit card, by the way. It was a ring that had a sign on it, and they would use wax. And if you stamped that, then you had the approval of whoever owned it to purchase whatever you wanted. So it was the old version of a credit card. And she got it, along with a goat. So, you want to hear the worst part about it? Out of that conception came twins, Pharez and Zerah. You know what's amazing about that? They're the next people in the line of Jesus. Let me introduce you to the next lady. It goes downhill from here. Go to verse 5. And Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse. Let's stop there. So Salmon begat Boaz of whom? Rahab. When you say Rahab, what are the next two words that come to your mind? Yeah, or the harlot. Yeah, that's right. I told you, I was warning you. Now, Rahab was a Canaanitess. In other words, she was unclean. She was outcast. She was Gentile, pagan. She was an idolatress. In other words, a very bad lady. She was considered a professional prostitute. Joshua chapter 2 tells us about it, and we don't need to look at it. It says that the spies, when they came into Jericho, went in and came into a harlot's house named Rahab. She was a harlot, a prostitute, but look, from her came Boaz. And do you know something about Boaz? Boaz was a godly man. He was a righteous man. Good man. There's a third lady here, verse 5 again. Boaz had a son named Obed, and Boaz was married to whom? Ruth. You say Ruth was not a prostitute. No. Ruth was lovely. Ruth was not guilty of incest. No, you're right. But you know what Ruth was? She was a Gentile. She was an outcast. The Israelites wanted nothing to do with them. Tell you something else. In Genesis 19:30, it's really interesting. Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountain, and his two daughters with him, for he feared to dwell in Zoar, and he dwelt in a cave, he and his two daughters. Here's Lot in a cave with his own two daughters. Y'all remember Lot, right? His wife turned to a statue. Same guy. The firstborn said unto the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come in unto us after the manner of all the earth. Remember, they just witnessed Sodom and Gomorrah. There's no other fellas around. I'm giving you a little bit of backstory of where Ruth came from, by the way. So, the first says to the younger, Our father is old, and there's not a man in the earth to come in unto us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drunk with wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve seed from our father. So they're going to get their father drunk and try to get pregnant from their father. Whew. This is in Bible, folks. That's why we're doing an adult class here. But they made their father drink wine that night. The firstborn went in, lay with their father. And when he arose, he did not perceive what had happened. The next day, the firstborn said to the younger, Behold, I lay with him last night. Let us do it again, and you lie with him this time. It's tragic to me that he didn't have backbone enough to say no. All right? Now, the younger arose, lay with him, and he perceived not to know what was going on. And when she arose, thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. Now, this is where it gets more interesting. And the firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. Moab is the son of the first daughter. This is the same group of people, the Moabites, that Ruth descends from. Again, in the Messianic line. Jesus' line is even tied to this terrible group of people. By the way, the Moabites were the ones who sacrificed their children to pagan gods in a furnace in order that they may get rain. That's what they did. Horrible, horrible people that was produced from Lot, the nephew of Abraham. And so, you want to know who Ruth was? She was a Moabite. She was born of incest. She herself was our pure lady. She was the wife of Boaz. And you want to hear something wonderful? She became the grandmother of David. She was born of a tribe of people who were guilty of incest, murder. In fact, Deuteronomy 23, verse 3, the whole Moabite nation is cursed by God. You'll see that. God literally curses the whole nation. And her God picks up a cursed lady born of an ancestral relationship with the daughters of Judah and puts her in the line of Messiah. Wow. Those are three of them. We've got one more left. The next lady in the genealogy at the end of verse 6. Let's read this, and we all know who this is. It says, and Jesse, the father of David, the king, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. It wasn't his first wife, Michal, who Saul appointed. This was Bathsheba. So David begat Solomon of her that had been the wife of Uriah. Who is this? We know it to be Bathsheba. Now, according to 2 Samuel chapter 11 and chapter 12, she was up on the roof. She was sunbathing. David looked down, saw her. First of all, the issue here, David was supposed to have been at war. Like, he was supposed to be fighting. It was normal for the king to be with their soldiers on the battlefield, but this time he was not, because the enemy that they were fighting at the time were presumed to be easier. So he stayed on home. And you see what idle hands will do when you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. But anyways, on the rooftop, he looks and sees Bathsheba, says, that's the one I want. He brought her over. He had a relationship with her, produced a child. She was an adulteress. And so you've got two harlots, one born out of incest and an adulteress. And they're the only four ladies mentioned in this genealogy of Jesus Christ. Now, so what is the message when we look at that? Anybody? Redemption. Yeah, that's a good word. So, again, two harlots, one born out of incest and adulteress. And now we get, I like the word, I like what you said, redemption. God is the God of grace. Grace. I'm going to stop for just a minute. There's a difference. We use these two words a lot in our church culture. We use grace and mercy. Two very different words. Okay? Mercy is placed on somebody who is found guilty. Okay? In other words, when God gives mercy, that means he gives mercy to whom he chooses to have mercy, meaning everybody's doomed, but he chooses who he's going to give mercy to. And then grace is a gift that abounds to all. A little bit different term. And I'm glad about that. I think that this genealogy, what's remarkable to me, if we keep this in context, that Matthew is addressing the Jews here, because that's his target audience. He's addressing the Jews, and he's writing down this genealogy. And they know it. They know it. They understand where this falls. It has to. And this has to be an absolute knockout punch against the Jews from Matthew. Because they don't like the fact that their Messiah comes from this stuff at all. You're going to see this over and over again. In fact, the number one accusation that the Pharisees have against Jesus is not that he's in this line. They don't complain about that. But they complain about the fact that he says that he's God. That's the issue that they have. They witness his miracles. They witness all that stuff. They see it. They can't deny his heritage. So the only thing they can attack is his deity. And we'll see that many, many, many times. Now, those leaders were legalistic. They had a lot of rules. And they were really into their pedigree and their purity and all of this heritage stuff. And so he introduces the Messiah as descending from two harlots, one adulteress, and one of incest, coming through a nation whose history was degenerative history, coming from two sinful men born to one sinful lady, was the King of all kings. Remarkable. As you study each gospel, I think I said this last week, each gospel presents Christ in a different way. It's one gospel, but there's 4 different messages here and how to present it. And the reason why that's there is so that it can preach to multiple groups of people. We have one addressed to Gentiles. This one addresses the Jews. We have one that addresses God's deity and also his humanity. And so we see evidence through the Gospels that Jesus is who he says he is, and it's validated throughout history, and we see it here in his genealogy. I want to explain this really quick before we go too much farther. Anybody ever study apologetics or heard of it? Maybe you've probably heard many preachers talk, like they try to prove the Bible accurately. Somebody like Ken Ham, that would be an example, with the Ark Encounter, the Creation Museum, stuff like that. Well, that would be what we consider the study of apologetics, which is it's a really interesting tool to have, like proving the ark existed or proving the case of Christ or the historical evidence, and all that is really interesting to have. It is a really good tool, but I want to make sure that in this study you're going to see some interesting facts, and I don't want us to get too hung up on that and we miss the message of the gospel, because that's the primary message. Even in Jesus' ministry, he healed the sick, he performed miracles, he did all of these different things, but the primary purpose was the gospel, to forgive sins, to provide a way out. Go with me to real quick to verse 18. We're gonna get just a little glimpse into this for a moment. We get the birth of Jesus Christ here. Now, this is a little bit different account than Luke's gospel, but we're gonna start here. It says, the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. We'll get to this later. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. And when Joseph woke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took his wife, but knew her not until she had given birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. So what we'll do is we're going to kind of outline what we're going to get into, and so we can be prepared a little bit more for next week, because I really don't want to jump into this next section because it's too good, and we don't have enough time. In the first section, we get the genealogy, and in the second part of this first chapter, we get the birth of Jesus. Now, chapter 1 proves that Jesus is King of the Jews. Okay? Again, our main theme is Jesus is King. Chapter 2, we're going to see Christ portrayed as the King of the Gentiles, which is remarkable. I think you'll enjoy that part. And then in chapter 3, we see the herald or messenger of the Messiah. which we see in John the Baptist. And then in chapter 4, we see the preparation of the Messiah. And then following that, we get into the Sermon on the Mount.